In late 2019, I decided to take on the task of reading all the Halo novels in chronological order. Yesterday, I finally went through the last 250 of over 13,000 pages. But how did I get here? I've been a Halo fan for just over 2 decades now, and one thing that's always kept me going with Halo is the lore, the backstory, the explanation for why you're doing what you're doing in-game. Prior to Halo, I wasn't that into video games. I always had them growing up, mainly playing Command & Conquer and Army Men, and while they were and still are great games, they never stuck with me and never drew me in and immersed me as much as Halo did. Halo was something unimaginably special to me. I always liked the scale of wonder and mystery conveyed through the games. I was never super into the multiplayer. For me, Halo wasn't about being competitive, it was all about the story. I remember playing the same campaign levels over and over again to the point where, to this day, I still know certain cutscenes by heart and could recite them from memory. I remember walking through a bookstore one day with my mother and seeing Halo: The Fall of Reach sitting by itself on the shelf, wedged between some other books. I was ecstatic. This was a time before social media, before the internet was really a household thing that almost everybody had, so I had no knowledge of a Halo book series even being a thing. I couldn't believe my eyes. I picked up the book and, looking at the front cover, saw multiple Spartans. Wait, multiple Spartans? That can't be right. Master Chief is the only Spartan, right? That's what the game says on the back cover. So the cover art for The Fall of Reach really drew my interest to the Halo universe. I wanted to know why there were multiple Spartans, who they were, where the Master Chief came from, what the Covenant's motives were, and what was the deal with the mysterious Forerunners and so on. Long story short, after some convincing, my mom got me the book and I took it to school for reading time. I was in the 4th grade. For those of you non-Americans listening, that's about 9 to 10 years old. Needless to say, when other kids brought to class their 50-page books made for children, me bringing a 300-plus page Fall of Reach was a bit of a shock to everybody. In the end, I was able to read it with about a 75% comprehension rate. Pretty sure I even wrote a book report on it. This was the start of my obsession with the Halo lore. As time went on, I finished The Fall of Reach. It took me half the school year. I was quite a slow reader. A few months later, I was in an auto parts store with my father, and it happened to be near the same bookstore that I got The Fall of Reach from. I asked if we could go and see if there was a new Halo book yet, and he agreed. Again, I have to emphasize here, this was a time before the internet, at least for my family. You couldn't just go on Amazon back then or search online to see if something was in stock. You had to physically go to the store to check not only if it was available, but if it even existed in the first place. But anyways, we went, and I found out that there wasn't one new Halo book, there were 3. So that evening, I walked out with a copy of The Flood, Ghosts of Onyx, and First Strike. So the actual order you're supposed to read these books in is Fall of Reach, The Flood, First Strike, then Ghosts of Onyx, but somehow I got things mixed up and read First Strike before The Flood. Needless to say, I was very confused. As time went on, Bungie's contract to make Halo games expired, 343 took over, more games and books came out. I stuck around for a long time buying and reading through the entire Karen Traviss trilogy, the Forerunner trilogy, the side stories, and the anthologies. I read all the Halo novels right up until around 2015. As you probably already know, 2015 was a rough time for Halo. Really, when isn't these days? But at the time, it was a bit surprising just how bad things were getting, as this was all new to us at the time. This was really the beginning of Halo's major downfall. Halo 4 hadn't been well received. The original 2014 launch of MCC was nothing short of a catastrophe, and when Halo 5 finally came out, it was a mixed reception at best, to say the least. I myself was quite frustrated with the state of the franchise at the time, and decided it was time for me to finally just walk away for a while and take a soft break from the series. I stopped playing the games regularly, and other than a few books I had gifted to me, I didn't read or buy any new ones, and I wasn't really in a rush to read the ones that I had on my shelf. Fast forward a few years to late 2019, and a lot in my life had happened. A string of constant bad luck mixed with other things that I won't go into detail, but long story short is, by November of 2019, I was feeling a bit lost, like I needed to recompile myself to sort of reset some things and go back to my roots. In addition to eating better, working out, and generally making better life decisions, I decided to start reading again, as in the past few years I was averaging about 1 book a year. I thought there was no better way to do this than to go back and read every Halo novel. All of them, including the ones I didn't have, in chronological order from start to finish. Old-fashioned reading. No audiobooks allowed. Before we get into the story of this massive journey, go ahead and hit the like button. It helps the channel out a lot. Let's get into it. So after dropping about $200 on Amazon to get the books I didn't have, seriously, there were a lot of Halo books released from 2015 and onwards, perhaps too many. In 2015 alone, there were 5 books released. Really gave a sense of quantity over quality, but more on that later. So for starters, I had to figure out what book to start with since the Halo books aren't exactly released in chronological order, something that kind of annoys me. I've always wished they would follow a comprehensive, consecutive 1, 2, 3 sequence with maybe a prequel or the occasional side story here and there, kind of like they did during the Bungie era of Halo where you had the original 4 books all in order, then Contact Harvest, which was a prequel, and Cole Protocol as a side story. I've never liked how the 343 era books are kind of all over the place, with some being released that take place right at the start of the Human Covenant War, others take place after Halo 3, then some take place after Halo 4, then they'll release another that takes place in the middle of Halo 2 for some reason. It would be nice if we got some kind of actual sequence, but maybe that's just me. I can kind of understand why they don't do it that way, as with a franchise like Halo, it would be really intimidating and not very friendly to newcomers if you had to have a working knowledge of all 32 books to understand the latest one, but still. I feel like there could be more of a balance between what we have now and what we had in the Bungie era. More on that later. Now, I'm going to try to keep this video spoiler light in case you want to read any of these books for yourself. If there is a major spoiler, I will warn you ahead of time. With that, I would like to point out that in this video, I'm going to say at least a few things that'll be contentious with everyone at some point, and that I realize a lot of my opinions are highly subjective. But like I said, try to remember that they are just that, opinions. It's okay if you liked the book that I didn't, or if you disliked something that I enjoyed. It's just my opinion. So back to where to start. As I said in the beginning of the video, there are over 13,000 pages of Halo lore in these books. To be exact, 13,120 pages. That's not counting the 2 comics I also read along with the various non-numbered stories at the ends of the definitive editions and Shadows of Reach. About 4 years, 13,000 pages, and I don't even know how many hours reading, but according to a quick Google search, the average reading time is about 40 pages per hour, but I know for a fact that I'm quite a bit slower, so I'll bump that down to 30, divide 13,000 by that, and we get 433 hours, roughly. So after receiving my Amazon shipment full of new books, I had to take a look at them and realize I wasn't going to be reading any of them anytime soon, as in the chronological order, the Forerunner Trilogy comes first. I had already read the Trilogy as I mentioned earlier, and a good amount of the other books, but I was starting from the beginning, which meant I had to reread a lot of material I had already read. Some multiple times prior, but I'm not complaining. Revisiting them more recently gave me a bit of a unique and renewed perspective, as with certain books it was like a whole new story since it had been many years since I first delved into them. For example, with Halo the Flood, I'm not even sure if I finished it originally when I was a kid. Thinking way back to middle school, I think the whole flood aspect of it kind of freaked me out, so I'm pretty sure I stopped reading about halfway through and then skipped to Ghosts of Onyx. So, getting to reread it this time around, and in proper order this time, was actually enjoyable and gave me a better understanding of the content. Over the course of the last few years, there was quite a few times when I drastically slowed down or sped up my reading. For instance, in late 2020, I ended up living abroad for a while. Then in 2021, I returned back to my home country, then moved out of my home state and bought a house and, well, moved. So, needless to say, I didn't have loads of time to read back then. I think during 2021, I only read about 4 books. 2022, I was just sort of lazy and caught up in other things, so I read maybe 6, with most of them being towards the end of that year. Then this year in 2023, I went full-on speed reader blitz mode and read the rest of the books. In the past month alone, I read Shadows of Reach, Divine Wind, Rubicon Protocol, and Broken Circle, none of which are short books. I had chosen to read Broken Circle last for 2 reasons. One, because as far as the timeline goes, it's kind of in a weird spot. A large chunk of the book takes place 500 years before the Human Covenant War, while another large chunk of it takes place during Halo 2, and then yet another part takes place after Halo 3. So I really didn't know where to put it on the timeline, so instead of chopping the book up into pieces like I did with the 2 anthology books, Fractures and Evolutions, reading their stories individually relative to their in-universe continuity, I just decided to read Broken Circle last. For simplicity. Well, that was one of the reasons. The other is really complicated and not relevant to this video, and it's something I might cover in the distant future when I get much more subscribers, so hit that like button for the algorithm. So what's the verdict on the actual books themselves? Well, the TLDR version is that they are a very, and I mean very, mixed bag. There are some that I genuinely loved and could not put down. A few examples of these are Halo New Blood, Rubicon Protocol, Ghosts of Onyx, and The Flood. Then, there were some other books that I wanted to pull my hair out reading, and every page was a slog and the whole book felt like a chore. Examples of these are Halo Retribution, Shadows of Reach, the entire Karen Traviss trilogy, and perhaps surprisingly to some, Contact Harvest. By far my biggest problem with many of the Halo novels is a lot of them feel like filler, or they build up to plot points that are ultimately never properly explored or have little impact on the overall story. The Karen Traviss trilogy is the biggest, but not only offender of this. With that, let me tackle The Thursday War, which is the second book of the three. Her entire trilogy is terrible in my opinion, by far, but The Thursday War is the worst of them. It really feels like she was intentionally dragging things out to fill more pages and sell books at higher prices. Before you go and say that's wild speculation, I actually found an interview with her and she specifically says her biggest incentive to sign on to write franchised books is the money, and she herself even points out in said interview that more pages equals more money. I don't want to play the interview here just for fear of copyright issues, but it's out there. Maybe I'll link it in the description so you could watch it yourself if you're interested. I've done quite a lot of research on the different authors of the Halo series, reading articles, listening to hours of interviews, and by far, Karen Traviss talks more about money than anybody else. In one interview, she straight up admits that she doesn't even like science fiction, nor reading novels, yet she chose to write sci-fi novels. In my honest opinion, the Karen Traviss trilogy didn't even need to be one. It could have been one long book or maybe two mid-sized books, but instead we got three absurdly long monologues with lots and lots of filler. Traviss said in the interview that she tends to write her books from the point of view of inside her characters' minds, which sometimes can be interesting, but more often than not, it just feels like rambling, with the same things being stated over and over and over again. Every book she writes is extremely slow-paced, with little actual story progression. Another thing about the trilogy is it really shows that she doesn't care for science fiction, and I'd even argue she doesn't even understand it when her dialogue between alien characters basically boils down to, "Me no like puny humans, because humans bad, and I'm an alien so I have to be evil." There's no depth to them at all. Even the human characters are incredibly bland and could best be described as one-dimensional or cookie-cutter. I hated almost every page of them. And then there's alien Rubik's Cubes. I wish I was making that up. The amount of emphasis and plot, especially in The Thursday War, that revolves around a character playing with a literal alien Rubik's Cube is just infuriating. I will give credit where credit is due, however, and say that the plotline in the third book, where she has the father of one of the Spartans trying to find his long-lost daughter, is interesting, though it's often broken up by long, arduous sections of monotony and more internal monologuing. There were also parts of Halo Glasslands, the first in the trilogy, that I quite enjoyed, but it basically picks up where Eric Nyland left off in his Ghosts of Onyx story, so maybe that's why I enjoyed it, because she kind of had her work cut out for her. She's just picking up where Nyland's left off. Now, the elephant in the room with the Karen Traviss trilogy, that anyone who's actually read these novels knows what I'm going to say next, is the fact that she makes Dr. Halsey out to be this evil, genocidal European dictator whose name I won't say because I'm afraid of YouTube demonetizing this video, but you all know who I'm talking about. He killed a couple million people, had a weird mustache, he was a jerk. You probably heard of him. Well, yeah, Karen Traviss, for some reason, decides that almost everybody in the UNSC just unanimously hates Dr. Halsey, the creator of the Spartan program, because they all collectively decide that said program was immoral, despite the fact that it literally saved mankind from certain annihilation, and the fact that many other people were involved in it, but for some reason all the blame falls on Halsey. Now, I've tried to justify and understand this by thinking that in real-life history there are many examples where individuals will be used as scapegoats and be forced to take all the blame for something that they were not entirely at fault for, but at the same time, the amount of just blatant, one-sided hatred for Halsey here is just cringy, and as I mentioned before, it's stated constantly, you cannot go a single page in this book without them bashing Halsey. It's like the entire personality of most of the human characters is just expressing their hatred for her. In reality, All historical figures are controversial, with many people having different opinions across a wide spectrum of beliefs regarding their actions. But in the Karen Traviss trilogy, everyone just hates Halsey. There's no nuance, there's no in-between, really. So for context, for those of you who are out of the loop, the Spartan program Dr. Halsey conceptualized and oversaw involved the kidnapping of 75 children across the human colonies in order to induct them into a rigorous military training program where they would be trained from the age of 6 to become these super soldiers, the best special forces humanity had ever known. During their early teenage years, the children would then undergo experimental and dangerous biological augmentations that many would not survive. However, those that did were made into the super soldiers we see in the games, the Spartans. Master Chief was a product of this program, and more detail can be found regarding it in the novel The Fall of Reach by Eric Nyland, a very good read that I highly recommend. While I definitely recognize that such a program is morally questionable at best, and it really sucks for the parents in-universe who lost kids to it, at the same time, it's not like Halsey set up this program intentionally just to kill innocent people for her own entertainment. Also take the fact that it was only 75 kids. 75. In a human empire that literally had billions, if not trillions of children, that was a drop in the bucket. Yes, again, it sucks if it's your kid who gets taken, and I definitely think the story she wrote regarding the father searching for his daughter was interesting, and I would actually like to see it in more stories. But the fact that almost every character just blindly hates Halsey for the program, it's just laughable to me. Does anyone in this universe have more awareness than what's going on immediately in front of them? Prior to the creation of the Spartan program, the human empire was literally on the verge of collapse due to an ongoing rebellion. You're talking about the potential for hundreds of years of progress and technological innovation being lost to a massive civil war, something nobody would have benefited from in the end. Already, as seen in the novel Contact Harvest, as well as in the short story Dirt, just to name a few examples, these very rebels were willing to take kids hostage and kill innocent civilians en masse. There's a scene at the beginning of Contact Harvest that's actually pretty good, where they blow up the entire diner, killing dozens or more. Then there's another one in Dirt, where they attack innocent people in a city. So, in one of these rebel attacks alone, more people were probably dying than in the entire Spartan program, including children. Again, I'm not saying Dr. Halsey was totally right. This is something even she struggles with in multiple books. She's shown to show some remorse, hesitation, regret, and rumination over her actions. But Karen Traviss would have you believe that Halsey is just an unredeemable psychopath who just likes to see people suffer for her own entertainment. I wouldn't mind it if there were a few characters who believed this, because again, it would show the diversity of opinions and ideas people have in the real world. But the fact is that it's nearly every character in her trilogy, and it almost feels like she's trying to push some kind of narrative or personal opinion, which, in my view, is something a writer should never do when writing fiction, especially when writing for an established universe that they were not the original creator of. It's one thing to have certain scenarios and arguments presented in a story, but a completely different thing to have it shoved down the reader's throat every other paragraph. In truth, each book in her trilogy does have some interesting plot points, but they are ruined by just how drawn out they are and the constant Halsey bashing. Between this central plot point, which is dragged out over the course of 3 books, and the massive amount of filler and internal monologuing, I can easily say that the Karen Traviss trilogy of novels are genuinely my least favorite out of all the books. I never want to read them again, although I know at some point I probably will, because I'm a glutton for punishment. My second least favorite author has to be Troy Denning. For those of you who have read the Halo books, I know, how could I say that? He seems to be one of the more popular ones out of the 343 era of books, and I can't understand why. I find his books to be very long-winded, boring at worst, and just okay at best for the most part. Before I go any further, one thing I have to say is that as far as authors go, I do actually respect Troy Denning far more than I do Karen Traviss. He doesn't seem like a bad guy, and he seems genuinely interested in Halo, and cares a lot about his work. I just personally dislike his writing style. That aside, the first book I read of his was Last Light, which I've actually read twice, once when it first came out, and once during my recent run-through of the whole series. It's an okay book. It tries to blend mystery and sci-fi together and has this subplot of corruption with interstellar politics sprinkled in between the natives of this planet Gao and the UNSC. It also introduces a brute character that'll be important in later books, but I don't know. I've always felt like there was too much going on in this one, and in a way, it goes through somewhat of an identity crisis in that it feels like it's not sure what type of story it wants to be at times. It never sat well with me, but I can appreciate the effort to try and do something different. Troy Denning currently has 2 sets of books in the Halo franchise divided into trilogies that each have some overlapping characters, which, again, I do appreciate, but like I said before, the overall stories themselves can be incredibly long-winded. He's got the Ferret Squad trilogy, of which the aforementioned Last Light is the first entry in, and the Master Chief story trilogy, which comprises the novels Silent Storm, Oblivion, and Shadows of Reach. I could be wrong on this, but I always thought that the Master Chief trilogy was made specifically due to the backlash fans had after Halo 5 barely featured Master Chief in its campaign. While I appreciate the attempt to listen to fans, the stories here weren't that good in my opinion, with my favorite book of the 3 being Oblivion. I think it was slow-paced, and it did though bring with it some very interesting sci-fi concepts. Light spoilers here, but in it, a large portion revolves around the UNSC trying to survive on a very hostile world, and they eventually encounter child castaways that were the product of a crashed ship that made its way to the planet many years ago and lost contact with the rest of humanity. I've always liked the idea of a sort of lost colony storyline, and Oblivion is the closest we get to that in Halo. Silent Storm is just a fairly generic story about the early days of integration of Spartans in the UNSC. It takes place during the beginning of the Human Covenant War, and while it's an era I enjoyed seeing explored more, I again found it to be a bit boring, and the pacing was far too slow, and not much happens in the book. I've noticed where Karen Traviss tends to have long internal monologues going on in her characters' heads, Troy Denning's characters tend to have a bit of that, and a lot of them just standing around talking, basically walking the reader through what's happening, sometimes almost literally spelling it out for people. It leaves little to the imagination and feels more like reading an instruction manual than a story at times. This issue is present in almost all of his books. Now, for the last, and in my view, the worst Master Chief story, we have Shadows of Reach. Light spoilers ahead. The story starts jumping way ahead of the timeline from early Human Covenant War to post-Halo 5, where Blue Team is tasked with the mission of finding Dr. Halsey's old lab, and retrieving something from it that will help them defeat Cortana. Despite taking place post-Halo 5, for some reason the events of that game have little impact on the story. The Master Chief faces no discipline for his actions during the game, the Guardians play an ultimately minimal role, the Banished are now a thing on Reach for some reason, and this is a thing that really annoys me, not just with this individual book or Troy Denning himself, but with just all of 343 era Halo as a whole. The amount of just pulling things out of thin air that 343 does. The last I knew, the Banished were on the Ark, but in Shadows of Reach, they're now on Reach looking for something. I really hate how we never heard of the Prometheans prior to Halo 4 either, never heard of the Banished prior to Halo Wars 2, yet 343 seems to want us to believe that these factions were all over the place, all the time, and always existed, yet they fail to maintain a logical continuity where they seem to put certain characters, factions, and locations on a shelf, while they constantly come up with new ones every game and book. Sometimes, I think they're trying to make the universe feel bigger, but what you end up with is just a loosely connected story with a severe lack of depth, and it feels less of a cohesive universe and more like a collection of underdeveloped ideas. But back to the book. Another thing that was bothering me throughout the whole thing is, with the Guardians being all over the galaxy and effectively monitoring everything, I mean, we even see how they monitor the Grunt homeworld in the book Bad Blood. How is it that the Banished are able to seemingly move so freely about, having this giant battle without drawing any attention from the Guardians? It is mentioned in the book that there are certain things that must be avoided lest they draw the attention of Cortana, but it still just doesn't sit well with me. The Banished as a faction haven't sat well with me since their introduction in Halo Wars 2. I love them as a concept, but the execution and explanations behind them have always felt a bit weak to me. The vast majority of Shadows of Reach has little to do with the whole going to Halsey's lab plot point, and is more about some random scavengers trying to rebuild Reach after it was glassed. Throwaway characters that we'll probably never see again. They have very little impact on the story and no impact on the overall universe. The actual mission given to Blue Team isn't even addressed until the very end of the book, where, aside from a plot twist that leads into the next book, little of significance actually happens. We don't find out how they plan to stop Cortana. There's no information relative to Halo Infinite, which was a big letdown because I was really hoping that there would be, since the book was released around the time Infinite was originally set to launch. Then there's one thing that really irked me. something I wasn't going to put in the script, but I just can't let go of. In the book, there's an anti-aircraft gun that we've also seen in The Fall of Reach, and it claims that this gun holds 100,000 rounds of ammunition. If you look at the gun in Halo Reach, again, it's the same gun, there's not any way it could carry this much ammo. There's physically not enough space. And while I'm far from a gun expert, carrying 100,000 rounds is not only impossible here, but even if it were, it would be impractical. The potential for jams, overheating, and the sheer weight of 100,000 of anything, never mind large bullets, just doesn't work. It seems like such an absurdly high number was used here just to sound cool, but for anyone that knows anything about firearms, it's just laughable. To give a bit of context to what I'm saying here, this is the closest real-life counterpart I could find, the Phalanx CIWS, which is meant to be mounted on naval ships. It uses the same type of round as its Halo counterpart, yet only has a capacity of about 1,500 of them. A quick Google search tells us that the 100,000 round capacity of the Halo anti-aircraft gun comes from the Essential Visual Guide, which according to the Halo Alpha apparently has lots of errors. So why this unrealistic depiction is used is a mystery to me, and it's not entirely Troy Denning's fault because, like I said, it was originally cited in the Essential Visual Guide, but there's also a much more reasonable number of just 1,000 rounds that's shown in Halo Reach, so why didn't he just use that? But moving on. Now to the Ferret Squad trilogy. The second book in the series, Retribution, again, feels a lot like filler to me. In fact, I've noticed that seems to be a trend with most trilogies in the Halo franchise. With Karen Travis's, both of Troy Denning's, even the Forerunner trilogy, for some reason the second book in each always seems to divert significantly from the main story, and we don't get to see where that main story goes until the third. It's no secret that 343 is a company that puts profits before anything else, so it makes me think maybe this is intentional. It's my understanding that while writers of the novels largely are given free rein to write the stories they want, it's also my understanding that 343 sometimes heavily gets involved, insisting that certain things can't be done or certain major plot points must be implemented, the last part being especially important. It makes me think back to when I said with Last Light how it seemed the story wasn't sure what it wanted to be. Shadows of Reach also gave me the same impression. It's like two different stories were being written at once. I've heard this was the case with Halo Infinite's development, as where multiple different games were being made essentially at the same time because no one could agree on which decision to take things in, so I wonder if the same is the case with the books. Slightly off topic, in an interview with Greg Bear, the author of the Forerunner trilogy, he states quite clearly that while he had free reign over the first two books, 343 became heavily involved in the last book's writing, and it was directly the decision of Frank O'Connor to, major spoiler alert here, so skip ahead if you don't want to know, make it so that Guilty Spark was originally a human. More on the Forerunner trilogy later, but anyways, Retribution was boring and forgettable. That's really all I have to say about it. Divine Wind was the final book in the Ferret Team trilogy, and it takes place literally right after Shadows of Reach. I actually quite liked Divine Wind, despite the fact that it recycles concepts from previous games and books. In both Halo 3 and the novel Hunters in the Dark by Peter David, a great read by the way, the UNSC has to go to the Ark to stop the Halo rings from being activated. Divine Wind basically has the same plot all over again, in that elements of the Covenant apparently survived and are trying to activate the rings again for at least the third time, except this time there's the twist that both the Banished and the UNSC want to stop them. Despite the unoriginal story, it's quite entertaining, and I would go as far to say as this is by far my favorite Troy Denning novel, and even shines through as, oddly enough, one of the better novels across the franchise. The pacing is far better than his previous entries, and overall, it feels like more happens in this one, and the recurring characters from the two prior Ferret Team books are actually interesting this time around. A big problem I have with the Master Chief stories is the fact that throughout the entirety of them, I know Master Chief isn't going to die. I know Blue Team will continue on. It leaves little wiggle room for any interesting kind of plot development, as with Divine Wind and the Ferrets, it really has you on the edge of your seat, and plot points happen that you would never expect to, but in a good way. There were a few things that I didn't like. For instance, towards the end, minor spoiler alert here, Ferret Team encounters the Spirit of Fire on the Ark, and I was expecting it to have a much larger impact on the story, but it doesn't for some reason. In fact, it hardly has anything to do with it. I feel like this was a huge missed opportunity and just overall doesn't make a lot of sense. You have the Banished on the Ark, a massive army aboard the Spirit of Fire, and yet we don't really get to see them help the Ferrets much at all. Then there was the fact that, in my opinion, Troy Denning grossly mischaracterizes one of the Spartan 2s of Red Team by writing that she threatened to throw a Spartan 3 out the back of a Pelican for ultimately no good reason. I'm being vague here on purpose to avoid major spoilers, and while I understand that we never got a big character development of Red Team's personalities, all Spartan 2s across the Halo media are generally fairly reserved despite their strength and size. They don't engage in displays of bravado or really threats. They tend to do what has to be done, and that's it. Now, if Troy Denning decides to develop this Spartan character as somewhat of an unhinged individual later down the line, I'd be okay with it if it's done well and there's more development there. Maybe this is the start of something bigger, but other than those two things, I have to say Divine Wind was a nice surprise, and I enjoyed most of it, bar those two gripes. I hope Troy Denning writes more books like this in the future. Next up, I have to talk about the two anthologies, Halo Evolutions and Halo Fractures. Both are compilations of short, mostly unconnected stories within the Halo universe. Fractures is one single book, while Evolutions is a bit more complicated. On the one hand, I own what I understand to be a somewhat rare version of the book, where it's all just one thing, but from what I've seen elsewhere, Evolutions is actually split into 2 volumes. Just a bit of a fun fact there. Where Fractures differs from Evolutions is that while Halo Evolutions mostly contains short stories not directly linked to anything else, many of the short stories within Halo Fractures almost serve as a kind of DLC to other books, and I honestly hate this, with 4 of them being directly related to actual full novels. One of them takes place in the middle of New Blood and is even written by the same author. It's like 343 went into the middle of the book, took out a chapter, and just sold it separately for some reason. Then there's literally just a part of the entirely separate story, Smoke and Shadow. It's supposed to be a short novella, and they put that in there, but just part of it, not the whole book, just like a chapter or 2 out of it. Basically a free but not free sample. I have never seen another book series do this before, and it's honestly kind of infuriating. For some reason, they also let Brian Reed, the infamous writer behind Halo 5's campaign, write a story in it, but it's only like 15 pages. Not really sure what they were thinking there. Even Frank O'Connor, the infamous former head of 343, wrote a short poem in there that's supposed to be funny, I think. I don't know. It doesn't contribute anything to the story or universe at all. I really found myself asking, what does this have to do with Halo? Is Frank just stroking his ego here by putting in something that he wrote? And then later on, he also threw in some weird story about artificial intelligence rights that I guess was supposed to foreshadow Halo 5 or something. I don't know. Fractures came out in late 2016 and is a really good indication of the state of the franchise at the time, but more importantly, just the lore. It's a mess. The whole book is a mess, and it seems like 343 just needed filler to pad the pages of the book and was just sourcing it from wherever they could find it. Overall, Fractures for me is a solid miss. Most of the short stories, even the ones that aren't the DLC type of thing that I talked about, are just okay at best. Shadows of Intent is the longest and best one. It's written by Joe Staten, so that's pretty cool, I guess. It just gives us some insight into what it was like during the fall of the High Charity from the Covenant's perspective. Actually, it is a pretty good story, but I can't recommend all of Fractures just for that. Between the 2 anthologies, Evolutions is by far the superior. It is, in my opinion, peak Halo in the vast majority of its short stories. Evolutions focuses more on slightly longer stories that generally feel like good standalone works and or actual proper expansions to existing stories. If Fractures is day 1 DLC that's just cut content from the base game, then Evolutions is a proper, fully fleshed out expansion pack well worth the money. Seriously, even if you aren't a big Halo fan, I recommend picking this one up. It is fantastic, for the most part. Sure, there is a story again from Karen Travis about Cortana and the Gravemind's tentacles. Yes, I'm serious, and sometimes the way it's worded makes you think that it came straight from a fanfic website, but for the most part, the other stories shine through. And there's even one from Frank O'Connor in there, but it's actually not that bad. It's not one of the stronger ones, but it's not bad. It's better than AI writes. But those two aside, nearly every single one of the stories in Evolutions is fantastic. The Impossible Life and Impossible Death takes a single line from the first game and makes it into an entire compelling, lore-rich narrative about the creation of the Cole Protocol and documents the mysterious life of the man behind it. I won't say anything else on that front to avoid spoilers, but wow, this story was great. Then you have Blunt Instruments, which follows the story of a Spartan team sent behind enemy lines, and it gives us a good view into the inner workings of the Yanmei, otherwise known as the drones. It's quite cool. Then there's Dirt, which goes into the origin story of the Rookie from Halo 3 ODST, and gives us a bit of insight into the conflict with the Human Rebellion, as well as some quarrels between members of the UNSC itself. It's kind of really just heart-wrenching towards the end, but again, because of spoilers, I don't want to say anything else. It really had me on the edge of my seat. Last but not least, I want to mention the Mona Lisa, which is by far the best story in the book. I kind of want to say what it's about, but at the same time I won't, because the beginning has a bit of mystery to it, and I would ruin it if I talked too much about it. So I won't tell you that much more details. Just know it takes place after the destruction of the first Halo ring aboard an Oni Prowler that's investigating the debris field. The story is amazing, gritty, hard to put down, and just overall written fantastically. Again, I have to say, Halo Evolutions is an amazing addition to the franchise, and I highly recommend you go and pick up a copy. I didn't go through all the short stories here in this video, because it's going to be long enough as it is, but I just wanted to share a few of the highlights along the way. With that, let's get to the next thing. The books that I would actually really like to recommend. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, overall the Halo books are a mixed bag, and thus far, bar the exception of Halo Evolutions, I've mostly talked about the ones I didn't like. So now I want to take the opportunity to talk about the positive things about the series. First things first, if you are still watching this video, thank you so much for sticking around. That means a lot to me. This video has taken a really long time to make between the reading and the research, the writing and the editing. It's probably my second biggest video in terms of production time, so if you haven't already, hit the like button if you're enjoying it. So I talked about my least favorite authors, but who are the best ones? Well, obviously Eric Nyland is going to be pretty high on the list. In fact, he's probably my favorite Halo author, full stop. He wrote most of the original Halo books and established much of the lore we know today. Nyland's first Halo book, The Fall of Reach, was written in just 7 weeks and built nearly the entire backstory of the original games. If you never read any of the other books, I recommend this one. I personally own 3 copies of it, 2 originals and 1 definitive edition. It is a fantastic read. While I would love to see Nyland return to Halo franchise, it doesn't seem likely. I found a Q&A on Goodreads from about 2 years ago where someone asked him when his next Halo book would come out, and he stated that not only has 343 not contacted him in many years, but also his and other authors' books were republished with no due royalties paid to himself or those others. While this post is from 2 years ago, it is absolutely unacceptable that this happened, and I hope he and the others got the money they were owed in the end. With that aside, I am a massive fan of his work. It is him specifically that helped to get me as much into Halo as I am today. Each and every one of his books is a masterpiece in my mind, with the weakest entry being First Strike, but don't let that discourage you from reading it. If the other Eric Nyland books are a 10, then First Strike is easily still a 9.8. I just enjoy the others a bit more. Another author I really enjoy, this time from the 343 era if you can believe it, is Kelly Gay. She is by far the best hope for Halo lore in the modern era. She's currently got quite a few books under her belt, and most of them are phenomenal. The way she brings up old bits of lore that many consider to be long forgotten, and then cohesively strings them together into her own new stories is just amazing. Once again, I won't say too much here to avoid major spoilers, but I highly recommend all of her books. My favorite and most recently released book in the franchise is one of hers, and that is Rubicon Protocol, a story that takes place during the 6-month gap when Master Chief is floating in space during the beginning of Halo Infinite. It's sort of its own little self-contained story that at the end of the day, while it doesn't have much impact on the rest of the game, that aspect's a little bit disappointing, but the overall story itself is incredibly well paced, and I couldn't put it down, and I read most of it in the span of a single day. The characters are mostly all new, and you really feel for them. That's one thing I have to say about her writing, but especially the writing specifically in Rubicon Protocol. It's gritty and mature, and I really wish we saw more of that in the modern Halo media. It feels realistic. 343 Industries seems to have taken a direction to appeal to a much younger demographic of players ever since Halo 5, and frankly, in my opinion, it's absolutely terrible, and it takes away from what Halo is, but this book doesn't have that problem. It's intense, graphic, and very grounded. It tells the story of some of the survivors of Infinity after it crashes on the Shattered Ringworld. Like I said, there isn't too much there that really changes anything, but it does add a nice little bit of context to the story and really paints a picture of just how bad a position the UNSC is in during the events of Halo Infinite, something I feel that was quite lacking in the actual game. My only real complaint is that for some reason the UNSC is using AIs quite extensively now with the Spartan 4s, as we see in Halo Infinite's multiplayer, and it's really not explained as to why and doesn't make much sense considering a whole bunch of them defected to join Cortana in Halo 5. I do wish this would have been touched on, and once again it leaves me wondering if it was only put in by 343 themselves to maybe promote the AI voice microtransactions in Halo Infinite, but that is admittedly quite speculative on my part. I have to say, the overall story was quite entertaining, and prior to reading this one, I was a bit unsure if I would buy any more Halo books. As I've pointed out, they're kind of a mixed bag, and the lore is all over the place, but I'm thinking next time Kelly Gay releases an entrance into the franchise, I'm going to pick it up for sure. Another thing with her that I want to touch on is just how passionate she is about Halo. Like I said earlier, I've listened to quite a few interviews in the process of researching for this video, and she by far seems the most interested and invested in the Halo universe. Throughout all of the interviews I've heard with her, I get the impression that this is someone who wants to write about Halo. She has openly expressed her love for Halo Wars as well as the campaigns in the franchise. She doesn't seem to be doing it just for the money or just to put Halo on a resume. She seems to do it out of genuine interest and care for the universe that she's writing in, and that is something I can not only appreciate but respect. In an age of Halo where 343 employees seem blatantly out of touch, comparing Halo to a P-word I can't say on YouTube, and talking about how they didn't even make the TV show for the fans, having someone working on Halo who actually seems to give a grunt's ass about it is so refreshing. Honestly, I say put her in charge of writing the games, give her a raise, she's great. A really underrated author I'd like to give a shout out to, perhaps paradoxically, given what I said about my disdain for 343 dumbing down Halo for younger audiences, is actually the author of the two Battleborn books, Cassandra Rose Clarke. If you aren't familiar with the Battleborn novels, they are shorter books meant to appeal to a young adult audience. When I first saw this, I rolled my eyes, but I was actually pleasantly surprised with how much I enjoyed both of them. They cover the invasion of Meridian, the glass planet we get to see in Halo 5's campaign, and I just found it really interesting. Throughout Halo, we generally only get to see the military side of things. There aren't too many stories about ordinary people just trying to survive, and getting to see a planet pre and during the Covenant invasion was awesome, and despite being a young adult novel, it was surprisingly gritty at times. The characters were also incredibly well written, everyone from the teen protagonist to the Spartan that helps them throughout the invasion. There's a nice level of growth and progression that we see in all of them. None are these infallible superheroes, while none are made out to be just stupid, pointless, useless kids either. I had been in New Hampshire during the late spring of 2020 when I finished the second book in a hotel, and I looked up to see when there was going to be a third one, as the second one ends on quite a cliffhanger, but sadly I read that while there was a third book in the works, it was ultimately canceled by the publisher, which in my mind is a real shame. One of the last authors I wanted to talk about specifically, who might well be my second or third favorite here, is Matt Forbeck. He wrote New Blood, Bad Blood, and Legacy of Onyx, and I think every one of those are fantastic, with Legacy being the weakest of the three, but still. New Blood and Bad Blood go hand in hand and tell the story of what happened to Alpha 9, the ODST squad you play as in Halo 3 ODST after the events of the game. These books are essentially ODST 2, and I love it. They have direct continuity with the games taking place after Halo 3 ODST and Halo 5 respectively. They're really well written, and I think Matt Forbeck gets the depiction of the characters from the game spot on. Legacy of Onyx was written as another young adult novel, which at first I was again skeptical of, and while I do have my gripes with the book, such as teenagers being given classified information by military personnel, it does sort of have an explanation for it. While it doesn't add a massive amount to the overall universe, it does add to the whole Onyx storyline started by Eric Nyland way back in 2006. I really wish 343 would just pick an author to continue to develop that planet story more, as currently it just keeps getting tossed around between three different authors. Though I think if they won't bring back Eric Nyland to do it, then maybe they should let Matt Forbeck do another book on it for sure. Legacy of Onyx does a great job mopping up Brian Reed's mess of a story from Halo 5, or if it doesn't totally mop it up, at the very least it gives us an actual reason to be concerned about the Guardians. One of my biggest gripes with Halo 5 story is it doesn't really show us why the Guardians are so dangerous and terrible. It just tells us a bunch of lame exposition, so Legacy of Onyx is actually a neat little story that does a pretty solid job of convincing us exactly why the Guardians are such a threat. The characters are mostly well written, and we get to see what a partially integrated life is like with humans and former Covenant now living side by side. It's pretty cool in the realm of science fiction to see such a thing, as I think in a lot of sci-fi media they tend to just gloss over the sociological implications of multi-species colonies. Overall, it was a great book, and I'd love to see some more of the characters we saw in future works. So the last books that I have to highly recommend is, controversially, the Forerunner Trilogy by Greg Bear. I personally found this trilogy to be fantastic. I remember the first time reading it, and it wasn't about what I thought it was going to be. I expected it to cover more of the Forerunner Flood War side of things, but the story that was actually written that I didn't expect was far better than what I was originally hoping for. It does unfortunately have to deal with the retcons imposed by Frank O'Connor, where the humans are made to be no longer Forerunners like they used to be, but for what he had to work with, I think Greg Bear did a fantastic job. The characters are rich and interesting, the pacing is good, and I genuinely felt a sense of immense loss and connection to the plot, as I saw what was once the greatest empire in all of Halo history fall apart, and the impact that had on the individual characters. Greg Bear had an astronomically difficult task to do with this trilogy, writing the lore and finally explaining to us how the Forerunner Empire fell, while also dealing with the challenges of working with a new studio. I'm actually half tempted to go back and read them now, just thinking about them. I have to say, I highly recommend all three. So that's my take on the best and worst books of the Halo franchise. Like I said, they're really a mixed bag overall. I can't stress that enough. There are a few in the middle that I didn't find to be particularly compelling one way or the other, such as the Cold Protocol and Envoy, both written by Tobias Buckle. I enjoyed Cold Protocol a lot more than Envoy, which felt way too much like a Marvel movie to me. Basically, the plot of Envoy is that after the Human Covenant War, a rogue faction of ex-Covenant wants to awaken some Forerunner servant life form called the Sharkoi, which will give them an army of essentially thousands of Hulk-like beings under their control, and I don't know, like I said, felt like a Marvel movie. There was also the fact that during Envoy, it's mentioned that Grey Team, which were introduced in the Cold Protocol, nukes a Covenant city essentially by accident after the war is already over. This is revealed through expositionary dialogue, and well, honestly, I'm a bit angry that we didn't get that story in Envoy instead. It would have been much more interesting, and in fact, that's a large criticism I have with the Halo books as a whole. A lot of things happen off-screen, so to say. I would think a Spartan team being stuck behind enemy lines and nuking a city after peace was made would be a big deal, and to just relegate it to a few lines of exposition is just... Again, I don't know what they were thinking there. It's like there was supposed to be a third book here between the Cold Protocol and Envoy, but there wasn't for some reason. Really makes me wonder what happened. The Cold Protocol itself is just an alright book. It can be a bit slow at times, and the story tends to jump around a lot, but it does have a satisfying ending, and it introduces us to some new lore regarding the Rebels, so there's that. Not much else to say about it. As I mentioned earlier, I have what is probably one of the most controversial takes on the books, and that is with Contact Harvest by Joe Staton. I personally enjoyed the early part of the book, but the rest of it just wasn't for me. I've read this one 2 times, and both times I've had to slog through it. We get to see humanity's first contact with the Covenant, as well as Tartarus and Johnson's origin story, but I don't know, I just didn't find it that interesting, as I never really felt you needed the backstory for those characters. Then towards the end of the book, there's a really big, spoiler alert, reveal that humans are Forerunners, which has absolutely no impact since it got retconned by Frank O'Connor. Seriously, can we just retcon his retcon? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. I hate Frank. I absolutely hate him. I am beyond glad that he's gone from 343, and I do not feel bad that he probably got fired. I don't. I honestly don't. Hate me for that if you want. Leave a dislike on the video, but I'm not mad. I'm not upset that he's gone. He deserved it. Anyway, there are just some weird things throughout. like an implied AI romance, a weird, I'll call it, coitus scene that I can't say the other word I wanted to say on YouTube. But yeah, Sergeant Johnson gets freaky with a throwaway character. But yeah, it's just not a very good book in my opinion. It has major pacing issues, and too many parts of it just seem incredibly slow and drawn out. But that's just me. I know a lot of people like this book. I'm just not one of them. But to each their own. The last two books I'll go into detail for are Hunters in the Dark and Broken Circle. Let's tackle Hunters first. The premise of this one is basically the UNSC returns to the Ark again to stop the rings from firing. The Banished aren't there yet, as this was written before they were a thing, and a small team of UNSC researchers and soldiers have to survive against the hostile conditions on the Ark, as well as a rogue Forerunner AI. We get a nice backstory to Spartan Vale from Halo 5, which isn't really that amazing. I find the overarching story involving the Ark to be far more interesting, but it's there. Overall, I would say this is an okay book. There are some moments where the book really tries to make Vale a superhero, which I didn't like at all. I mean, this book was kind of a product of the mid-2010s era of female character can do anything, and it shows. That aside, there are also some great moments where the mystery of the Ark and the Forerunners are very well portrayed. Overall, I liked it, but from a character development standpoint, it wasn't anything special. We also get to see some of the elites from Halo 3's co-op mode, where if you had 4 players, you'd get that red and blue elite. Yeah, they appear, but they're ultimately throwaway characters, as we never see or hear from them again, and they don't do anything that significant, so that's that. The best thing for me, I think, was the pacing, and it's a pretty interesting plot twist towards the end, but I won't say anything on that to avoid major spoilers. So last, but certainly not least, is Broken Circle. Are you subscribed to that channel? Right, so now on to the Broken Circle book. It's pretty good. It's written by John Shirley, who's a decent writer in my opinion, but I find the first half or so to be far more interesting than the last half. The first half covers the early days of the Covenant, which is sort of uncharted territory for the Halo novels, and it's done pretty well. I think Shirley really did a great job of encapsulating the ideologies of the prophets and elites and explaining the complexities of how they came together to form the Covenant without making it too long-winded. The second half of the book, however, I think is where it starts to suffer. Honestly, I don't even think the second half needed to really be a thing. There are some interesting links to Halo 2 and definitely some interesting potential for future lore regarding a new Splinter faction of elites, but then again, I think it suffers greatly due to 343's constant additions of new Covenant factions. Throughout all the books, we have the Banished, the Servants of the Abiding Truth, the Keepers of One Freedom, and then another group that just calls itself the Covenant still, and that's just listing off a few. If all of those didn't exist, or at least there were less of them, or maybe more distinction between them, I would say Broken Circle's later half would be a bit more interesting, especially if it was built on, but it hasn't been built on, and this book came out years ago, so it just seems like there's another ex-Covenant faction out there. They're really a dime a dozen at this point, and that's a big issue I have with 343's depiction of the Covenant as a whole. As I've mentioned a few times, they keep making these new factions both in the games and in the books, but there isn't really enough to distinguish them from one another, and this is coming from me, someone who has read all 32 of the Halo novels. A lot of these guys just boil down to basic aliens who don't like humans because heretics this and heretics that. To this day, I don't even understand what the Banished issue is with humanity. It really isn't explained well, and that's kind of just an issue with a lot of 343's lore. All these concepts that are drummed up and then dropped or never mentioned again, or they'll take 5+ years to build on them. But back to the Banished, I really don't get it. Why are they trying to exterminate humanity? Sure, I get that they want power, they think humans are weak, but it just seems like they're just there as stand-ins for the old Covenant at this point, except they remove the religious aspect of them, which is kind of what made the Covenant interesting in the first place, but that's just my 2 cents, which brings me to my next section, and that is what I would like to see in the future regarding the Halo novels. So I've said a lot here, and I won't keep you much longer. I honestly went into this video not knowing how long it would be. At first I was thinking 30 minutes, then maybe an hour and a half, but it is whatever it is, probably coming around an hour at this point. Overall, I had fun reading the Halo books, bar a chunk of them that were genuinely infuriating, mostly ones written by Karen Traviss or Troy Denning. I think the biggest problem is just how many novels were written by those two. Karen Travis only had 3, but they were very long. To put it in perspective, Mortal Dictata, her third book, had 528 pages, the same amount as Halo Evolutions, both volumes combined. Halo Evolutions contained 18 separate stories, and Mortal Dictata was just 1. Like I said earlier in the video, it was just far too drawn out. As for Troy Denning's entries, there are just too many of them, and I honestly think they just need to get another author. Bring back Eric Nyland 343, and please actually pay him properly this time. I even wouldn't mind seeing William Dietz, who wrote The Flood, to come back. I know a lot of people didn't like that one, but I thought it was pretty good. It was a novelization of the first Halo game with a lot of extra information. They introduced us to the ODSTs in that one, they told us about bases the UNSC set up on the ring, and then a crazy plot to capture a Covenant ship to escape. It really is quite a good book that adds a lot to Halo 1's story, and I don't know why it doesn't get more positive recognition. With that, I don't think Troy Denning should be fired or anything crazy like that. Like I said earlier, I may personally dislike his writing style. I really think Shadows of Reach missed the mark, and so did Retribution, but Last Light wasn't too bad. It was alright. Neither were the Master Chief stories. Divine Wind was actually pretty good, except for the ending and a few other bits, so I can't complain too much there. I just think maybe to have him not write as many of the books. Like I said earlier, a lot of people do like him, and he does seem to care about what he writes, but he's just not my cup of tea. And I think that the amount of books he releases is just a little bit oversaturated. As for the too many books comment, though, really, like I said earlier, this is just a complaint I have with the Halo franchise in general. Look, I like a lot of them. I had fun reading through a good portion of them, but at the same time, I really think it would have been better if they just spaced the releases out a little bit more. We don't need 2+ books a year. There have been quite a few years where we keep getting that. Give us time to digest the last one we read, to go back and maybe reread ones that we haven't caught up on, or just reread things we'd like to read again. Let there be a bit of hype around the new one. Don't just push them out twice a year just for the sake of it. Call this what you want, but even as an adult, I still get every new Diary of a Wimpy Kid book when it comes out, just because I enjoy seeing what Jeff Kinney will come up with next. Even if those books are kind of crap, they're entertaining, and only one comes out per year, so it's a little guilty pleasure of mine to just laugh and cringe at it a bit and enjoy the absurdity. It's all in good fun, but again, the Halo books coming out as often as they do feels like a bit too much, especially when the stories are so disconnected from one another. Ideally, I'd like to see only one book released per year, even if they start making them a bit longer. I'd definitely love to see a book by Kelly Gay or Eric Nyland come out that's 500 or so pages. Now, I realize I might be in the minority there, but again, that's just me. Another thing I'd really like to see with the Halo books, as I mentioned earlier, is a more cohesive story. Give us a sort of mainline story that the books follow. They don't have to, nor do I really want them to center around the Master Chief. Chief as a character is actually quite boring if you ask me, and he's more of a self-insert for us to take control in the games. I think he's just better relegated to that slot. But I wouldn't mind seeing a major plot point revolving more around Blue Team or even Red Team with the Spirit of Fire. Seriously, the Spirit of Fire, its crew, and really everything from Halo Wars are criminally underused in the Halo universe as a whole. The Halo Wars games in general, I feel like, are kind of the black sheep of Halo games, where for some reason 343 really doesn't seem to want to acknowledge them that much. A bit off topic here, but the post-launch support for Halo Wars 2 was severely lacking, and then they didn't even implement a proper multiplayer system for the PC port of Halo Wars 1. But back to the books. Like I said, a more cohesive direct link between novels would be nice, even if it requires some backtracking on the part of the reader to read previous books. I realize why, in a way, this might be risky for 343, but I think that it would go a long way and would still be viable because, after all, most of the people who read these books are like die-hard Halo fans, especially the ones that read the more recent ones, and I think if you gave those fans a consecutive story, they'd definitely be into it. I know I would be. The other thing I would say is to fill the gaps and release things in order, too. Like I mentioned before, they tend to release books drastically out of order or have events happen off-screen that majorly impact the plot of other stories. Sure, it's more extreme in some cases than others, but it really feels like a kick in the face to read all these books and have one take place in 2557, then another that takes place in 2559, but then the next one released goes back in time to 2558, so everything you just read you have to keep in mind. It's just very confusing. Then you of course have the issue I mentioned with Halo Envoy, where you have major events just skipped over and revealed later through exposition. It's not good, and it just comes off as unorganized and a bit lazy. The next thing I would have to say is less side stories. It's totally fine to have them here and there. After all, they can't possibly tell every story at once. But I just wish there was one mainline story that perhaps ran parallel to with what we see in the games, sort of like what the old Bungie era books did. They told the origins of Master Chief and the Fall of Reach, gave us a novelization of Halo 1 with the Flood, filled in the gaps between Halo 1 and 2 with First Strike, and then they gave us insight into what was happening with the rest of the galaxy in Ghosts of Onyx. Really nice format they had, which brings me to my next request. Novelizations of all the games. Why we only got one for Combat Evolved and sort of for ODST with the first part of New Blood is well beyond me. Again, I know The Flood was kind of a controversial book and it's widely considered to be the worst of the originals, but I still think it's great and I feel like it would draw more people to the games. Maybe people who read a lot could be more invested in the franchise if the events of the games were actually covered in the books. I mean, I don't get it. They seem to release books like crazy. They want to release more content. Members of 343 seem to constantly talk about appealing to a broader audience, and the now former head of 343, Bonnie Ross, literally once said she wanted Halo to be like Star Wars, which does have novelizations of the films, so where are our novelizations of the games? It just seems like a huge missed opportunity. Although it just occurred to me that the novelization of the Clone Wars movie was written by Karen Traviss, so please 343, whatever you do not hire her again. Do not. Karen Traviss needs to be locked out of Halo forever. Anyway, so that's it. In conclusion, it's been a wild ride. 4 years of reading, well over 10,000 pages, a lot of frustration, and at the same time a lot of cool moments, but that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you at least found some entertainment value out of it, and if you did, leave a like on the video. It really helps me out a lot and gives me motivation to keep making this type of content. Subscribe if you're new around here, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to watch. I am Broken Circle, and as always, I hope you enjoyed. Have a great day, stay safe, and goodbye.